and welcome to the latest video in the 𝗪𝗁𝗃 CRO video series, where we will be discussing tactical considerations for IVD clinical trials. I'm Margot Borgel, the Director for IVD Global Regulatory Affairs, and I'm joined today by two of our clinical trial and IVD experts, Brandy Chittester and Lauren Birch. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Margot.
I'd like to start out with the very basics. So, Brandy, when we're planning clinical studies, can you talk about the options for outsourcing and how you decide what is the right model for you to use?
Sure. Yeah, I think, like you said, from the basics, we want to think about what resources are available in-house or what we need to outsource. So you can do some things yourself and then outsource other pieces. And then you can also look at outsourcing the entire clinical trial. And it can range from everything from the regulatory and clinical aspects like we're talking about, but also to providing the supplies to the different sites that you're going to work with and how we're going to track those things. So it is really dependent on the type of trial and the resources available and, of course, budgeting and those kinds of things too.
Sure. Yeah. And Lauren, I'm going to throw this one to you. What considerations do you think are most critical for IVD studies?
I always think that it's a great strategy to identify your end goal and then work your way backwards. Ultimately, this will impact your study design and your budget. For example, are you looking to sell your product in both Europe and the US? In that case, it may be best to run your clinical trial in the US because then you can use your data for EU submissions. However, you can't use your clinical data from the EU for US submissions, for FDA submissions. So taking into consideration a lot of those items. Another one is identifying your payer landscape. So is there a precedent for your product in the market? Will your payers be comfortable reimbursing you, or will there be resistance? How many competitors do you have in the space? Really, the goal is to get paid back for all your hard work, right? And making sure that you're really going to be profitable. Taking into consideration the end goal and sort of working your way backwards, I think is always been a great strategy.
Yeah, that's really great. I also think that considering your preclinical testing and what you need to do for that is really important. The preclinical testing really supports your study design. So any studies you run leading up to your clinical trial are going to give you the important information regarding performance of your device. That'll help in setting appropriate endpoints, selection of comparator devices, things like this. This is going to include both your analytical studies and potentially pilot or feasibility studies run at clinical sites. Sometimes we see an overlook of this or a dismissal of this kind of a feasibility study or a pilot study because of budgetary concerns or just not realizing that you need it. But skipping this study could really be costly because if you don't know how your device is going to perform in the hands of the actual users, anything can happen during the clinical trial. So it might take longer than anticipated, or it might even ultimately fail to meet the endpoints you've set if you don't have an appropriate basis for those endpoints and acceptance criteria. Brandy, what do you think from the execution side of things?
Yeah, you made some really good points. And I think when I think about setting up for the trial, going out and finding the right sites that are going to either collect the samples or test them, putting together the documents for submission, all of these things need to be ironed out in order to complete those documents. And there's always a lot of questions like, well, how much space am I going to need for storing, materials? How do I handle this when I get them? Like, how are we going to run controls? Where do I put the product? Like, there's so many things to think about. So if there are some preclinical tests that aren't complete yet, you often can't finalize your protocol or finalize consent forms, and you can't answer all those questions. And the synopsis isn't always enough to be choosing the sites and taking them all the way through. So good points.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think another very important thing is choosing the right clinical lab, right? Ideally, you would have a clinical lab that will not only be able to test with your primary comparator, but also have a secondary comparator that you can use for any discordance. You also really need to be clear with what is their plan for storage and testing. So are you running this frozen or refrigerated? And then are they going to be freezing it afterwards? And is that going to potentially impact your second if you do have to rerun the test? What happens if the equipment breaks down? What's their timelines look like for getting somebody on site to repair that? And is that going to impact your study? Also, what are their validation, or what have they been validated with? That's crucial, right? So you really need to know who you're working with, because whoever is running your comparator is really going to drive a lot of the data. So that can be a very important aspect of this as well. Another thing to take into consideration is kitting. I've done quite a few of these studies, and I've always found that a very simple kit, or a kit that makes it very simple on the site, I should say, leads to sort of better outcomes, right? Having everything pre-labeled, everything in a nice complete package, having everything, you can even include an ICF in there. You can also include potentially even a paper CRF for them to fill out, but making sure that whoever's on site understands all of the things that they need to do quickly and can kind of move through the process efficiently. That's going to endear you to your clinical sites as well. And it will probably enhance and speed up enrollment. So eliminating human error and increasing your enrollment time. So kitting is something that a lot of other clinical trials don't really have to think about, but us in the IVD space, our comparator labs are generally not making the kits for us. It's something that you do have to build into your clinical study design.
Yeah, if I could jump into and add to that, Lauren, you made some really good points. And there's also some oversight, like automations or, checkpoints that we can build in that really help. Because, when we're running these studies, sometimes you're getting a giant number of samples per day. So if there's an error in the processing anywhere, whether it's in the kitting or the data collection, or, how the sample was stored or processed, it could potentially touch a lot of samples. And it's any 1, 2, 3 days before you can take a look at how it's going can really be an impact. So anything that can be automated, reminders, things need to be happening. When you put the kit together, making sure that the case report forms, like you said, are really clear on exactly what steps need to happen and just kind of make it really obvious. But then also having some ability for like a monitor to be able to check in and make sure that the data is accurate and correct without having to make a really formal visit and review a lot of information, but being able to have that collaboration is really key as well.
Yeah, that's really great advice. All right, and bringing us to my last question for you guys. I think cost is something that's really important for manufacturers, everywhere, but especially IVD manufacturers and their investors when we're bringing new IVDs to market. And so what are some strategies for keeping costs down when we're planning a clinical trial? I think clinical trials typically represent one of the higher cost activities. And so where can manufacturers be stingy and where should they spend the money?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to where we just left off with monitoring, there's a lot you can do remotely and in real time. And that's the stuff that's really going to help build efficiencies and hopefully give that real time feedback to help adjust and correct immediately, rather than waiting, a certain amount of time and then doing a spot check on a lot. Kind of keep a good pace with it. And if we can do that remotely, of course, we're saving on travel time and some of these other more formal aspects of traditional monitoring, like we might think about with other kinds of clinical trials. And then sometimes we can even look at, adaptive trial design. So maybe taking a look at some of the data as we go, and maybe certain number of samples we can stop collecting at that point rather than collecting a larger number based on how everything is turning out. So those are a couple that come like immediately to mind, but I'm sure Lauren has some other ideas to share.
Yeah, just to touch on that point for the adaptive trial designs, having a good pilot study can be very important as well before you get into sort of the costly pivotal study. So, this doesn't have to be run through a standard clinical trial design. A lot of biospecimen providers will do prospective collections that will meet essentially all of your needs in terms of identifying and determining whether your product, all your validation needs, but don't have sort of the burden of, a heavy EDC system and monitoring. And so that can be a really good option to sort of do sort of a test run before you get into sort of a costly 1,000-person pivotal study. I've always found that if you can get as much data as you can early on, just to ensure that you're getting what you need out of the pivotal study.
Thank you. That's great. Well, that's all I have today. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.
Right. Thanks for
Thanks.
having me.